Well, welcome back to part 3 of the Integumentary System 2 lecture, and we'll be having a look at the glands of the skin. So there's obviously 3 glands of the skin. We'll talk about these in a second, but in this micrograph, this is a really cool section actually. It's taken from the skin of the axilla. So the axilla, of course, is the armpit, and in this section we've got all 3 glands. So it's quite unique that we have all 3 glands in the one section. So we've got some sebaceous glands, which are coming off these glancing sections through the hair follicles. We've got some eccrine sweat glands. You can see them scattered throughout. And then we've got these apocrine sweat glands, the ones with the big lumen. So we'll talk about them, how to identify them, and what their structure and function is in a bit more detail. So the learning objectives for this relate back to the other one which we looked at, this time focusing on the pilosebaceous apparatus, or the sebaceous component of it, and of course the sweat glands. So as we know, there's 3 different types of glands which exist within the skin. Sebaceous glands, which are an example of holocrine secreting glands, so they're the cells that the whole cell becomes the secretion, and they form or produce a secretion called sebum, which is a lipid-based secretion. Then we have eccrine sweat glands. These are found in every part of the skin. They're responsible for merocrine secretion, so they undergo exocytosis and they produce sweat. And they produce 2 types of sweat. They produce both sweat that's involved in thermoregulation, so keeping your body temperature down, as well as emotional sweat. So if you're sitting for an exam, you're on your first date, your palms get sweaty, it's because of this emotional sweating. So it's part of the flight or fight response that we all experience. The third type of gland is called the apocrine sweat glands, or sometimes referred to as odoriferous sweat glands because they produce body odour. We'll talk about that in a little while. Now, despite their name, and there's still controversy about this, so this may not be 100% accurate, but you recognise that, and you know that what I think here, that they use merocrine secretion. So they use exocytosis, not apocrine secretion. So we'll talk about why that misnomer was identified early on. And despite, or in comparison with eccrine sweat glands, they only produce sweat in relation to emotional sweating. So again, the fight or flight response. And we'll talk about why that is in a little while. So we're going to start off with having a look at sebaceous glands, and we've already, seen these a little bit when we looked at the pilosebaceous apparatus in a bit more detail. If you remember their classification, they're a simple branched acinar gland, so they have one duct, and they branch, and they have rounded secretory components. And they secrete an oily, thick substance called sebum. So because it's lipid-based, they have lipid droplets in their cells. Lipid droplets don't have cell membranes around them, so they can't undergo exocytosis. So the cells need some way to get out, and they can either use apocrine secretion or holocrine secretion. In this case, sebaceous glands, of course, use holocrine secretion. So the whole cell becomes a secretion. They open onto the skin surface via a hair follicle. So rather than having a duct of their own, for the most part, now this is not 100%, but for the most part, they release their secretions, they release the sebum via the hair follicle. So the hair follicle actually forms the duct. So they branch off the hair follicle, and then the space where the hair shaft runs has a little space next to it. And so that becomes the duct, and then empties onto the surface of the skin that way. The secretions that they produce, the sebum, is quite a viscous substance, and so may become secondarily infected by bacteria. And if that's the case, you get a little inflammation in that area, and you end up with acne or pimples, as we more commonly know them by. The secretion is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and it's thought that their activity is controlled by sex hormones. So once puberty hits and those sex hormones start going nuts, one of the consequences is that the secretion of your sebaceous glands increases. Number of them may become secondarily infected, and you end up with acne or pimples. And we know that pimples are often an early sign of puberty. Now, sebum is actually an important lubricant of the epidermis, so it keeps the skin surface soft, and that protects it from damage so that it doesn't crack and then expose the underlying blood vessels and therefore opening the body to infections. It also is a lubricant of the hair, so that the hair can rub against each other and not mat together, so that the oil keeps the hair lubricated as well, allows the follicles or the shafts of the hair to rub over each other without actually sticking to each other. So here, up in the top left-hand corner, we've got this classic branched acinar appearance. So we've got our single duct, in this case it's the hair follicle, and then we've got one acinus here and another acinus on the other side. So we've got this branched acinar structure. So remembering it's a downgrowth of the epidermis, just like the hair follicle is. So it sits on a basement membrane, or a basal lamina here. It has the basal cells, from which the other cells arise. They undergo mitosis. One of those moves out and becomes a sebaceous gland cell. The cells accumulate lipids. So when we actually look at them under light microscopy, remembering that lipids get washed away for processing, we have these cells which have these little holes within their cytoplasm. So they look like little sponges, if you like, with a round nucleus in the middle. So they have lots of lipid droplets. They migrate their way towards the duct. As they do, eventually these cells undergo cell death, so their nuclei change appearance. They appear very irregular in shape, very dark staining, and we call that appearance of a nucleus pycnotic. So those cells have a pycnotic nucleus indicating cell death. The cell membranes then rupture, and then their secretion, which forms sebum, is released. So you can see this in equivalent in this light micrograph here. So here's a couple of sections showing out. This one on the right hand side is a really great example of that structure. So here's our basal cells. So here's our hair follicle on the left hand side. We've got this little space next to the hair shaft itself. So our basal cells are down here. We've got our nice healthy sebaceous gland cells here. The nuclei begin to darken and then they become very irregular in shape as the cells undergo cell death. So they're very pycnotic. You can see the cytoplasm is quite disrupted here now, and the membranes rupture, releasing the sebum into the space next to the hair follicle, and that makes its way onto the surface there. So again, we've just got this big cross section through a hair follicle here with the hair shaft in the middle here, and then we've got our various epithelial root sheaths here, connective tissue of the reticular dermis, and then here we've got our sebaceous gland. So these are the basal cells on the outside. These are our nice healthy looking sebaceous gland cells, and then we've got our dead looking cells here. So it's as if we've taken a section right through this region here of the gland, and that's what we're looking at here. So that was the sebaceous glands, and now we're going to move on to the first of our sweat glands, and these are the most common type of sweat glands found in the body. These are known as eccrine sweat glands, or sometimes referred to as sudiferous sweat glands. They're classified as simple coiled tubular glands, and they're, out of all three, they're the ones that open directly onto the surface of the skin via a duct, and they have a little opening on the surface of the skin called a sweat duct, or a sweat pore is the more common term. They use merocrine secretion, remembering that means that they use exocytosis. The secretory portion of the gland lies very deep in the dermis, so in the reticular dermis, and then the duct portion spirals its way all the way through the reticular dermis, through the papillary dermis, and then through the epidermis. You can actually see often a spiral pattern within the epidermis, and that's a good indication about where, if you follow that down, where you'll find the secretory portion. So the sweat which we produce is a mixture of secretory and excretory products, so we can get rid of some of our nitrogenous waste like urea through our sweat, and we also secrete some glycoproteins and things into that sweat as well. As I mentioned, there's two different types of sweating: emotional sweating and thermoregulatory. So we're looking at evaporation, and emotional sweating is a little bit different. And sweating is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So eccrine sweat glands have two components. They have the secretory component and they have the duct component. Within the secretory component, we can actually find three different cell types. We can find the dark cells, represented here as these sort of blue cells in this diagram. And they're responsible for the proteinaceous secretion, so the glycoprotein that's often released into sweat. The clear cells, indicated here, this sort of orangey colour, release the watery secretion, so the water and the ions components, so the chloride ions and sodium ions and things like that. So salt is one of the components of our sweat as well. And then thirdly, there's a third type of cell called a myoepithelial cell. And this is a contractile cell. We can see it sitting on the basal lamina here in pink. And that's responsible for contracting and helping to move the sweat through the ducts and then out onto the surface of the skin. So here we've got a magnified view of the secretory portion of the skin, a secretory portion of the eccrine sweat gland. Here's the lumen of the gland here. So here we've got our clear cells. Dark cells are here. You won't have to identify any of these in section or anything like that, but just be aware of the three cells within the secretory portion of these glands. So here, so we can see, because they're coiled, we've got multiple profiles of these cells. Here and out here we've got the duct portions, which is lined by a stratified cuboidal type of epithelium. Now these sort of elongated cells here, quite pink in this section, these are the myoepithelial cells, and you can see them sort of extending around the outside of these ducts here, these glands, and they contract and enable the sweat to move through the ducts. And as mentioned, the duct portion is a stratified cuboidal epithelium. And you'll notice it quite clearly in a histological normal H&E staining section of skin. I'll show you a picture of these in a little while. So just reminding you that sweating can be of two types, thermoregulatory and emotional. So thermoregulatory sweating is brought about by acetylcholine of the autonomic nervous system, whereas emotional sweating has receptors, or what are called adrenergic receptors, which are receptors responsible for binding adrenaline. So you know when you get anxious that adrenaline pumps through your system, the adrenaline binds to these receptors on these cells, and that causes them to release sweat. Whereas thermoregulatory sweating is controlled internally. Your body detects a high temperature. It stimulates the autonomic nervous system to release acetylcholine that binds to these receptors, cholinergic receptors in these cells, and they release sweat in response. So lastly then are the apocrine sweat glands. Just like the eccrine sweat glands, they're simple coiled tubular glands, with the exception that they have big, large secretory lumen. That means they have the big space where they store their secretion prior to being released. It's very different from eccrine sweat glands in that respect. So while they're classified the same, the secretory portions look very, very different with the big, wide spaces. Unlike eccrine sweat glands, and like sebaceous glands for the most part, they open onto the skin surface not via a duct directly, but via a hair follicle. The cells secrete by merocrine secretion, despite their name. The secretory portion, just like in eccrine sweat glands, lies deep in the reticular dermis, with the exception that the secretory product is stored prior to release. And because it's stored, and because it does have a sort of a lipid component associated with it, it's often viscous and may become secondarily infected. And this time, rather than forming pimples, it's responsible for body odor. So just like the sebaceous glands, its activity is controlled by sex hormones. So puberty hits, you get pimples, and the other thing that happens is you begin to stink. So you increase secretion by these apocrine sweat glands in the armpits and in the groin region, the anogenital skin, and body odor is typically associated with this secondary infection of apocrine sweat glands. So these glands are concentrated in the axilla, which is the armpit, and the anogenital areas. I'm sure you know where that is. I don't need to explain that. We do have modified versions of apocrine sweat glands, however. Now, in the ear, they form these glands called ceruminous glands, and they form wax. They secrete the wax, which is high in cholesterol. So wax is a higher cholesterol secretion. Obviously, it's lipid. Cholesterol is lipid, and therefore it's a modified version there. One thing you may not be aware of, however, is that mammary glands are also thought to be modified apocrine sweat glands. And of course, instead of releasing the lipid onto the surface like we do with these apocrine sweat glands, they're actually producing a lipid which the baby consumes. So we're talking milk fats associated there. So much so that some textbooks actually describe mammary glands in the chapter on the skin, the integumentary system, rather than describing them with the reproductive systems. Its secretion is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Its secretions are not thermoregulatory, they're only emotional. Okay, so they're only in heightened times of arousal, be that fear or sexual interest, they're stimulated and they secrete these secretions. And it's thought, and I think this pops up in the next slide, it's thought that in non-human mammals it's responsible for pheromones, so an indication to a mate that you're receptive for mating. Humans, obviously a little bit more controversial. So here we've got a section of apocrine sweat glands. Now, the arrows are pointing to some regions where we've got this sort of apical blebbing on these cells. So the first thing that you'll notice compared to the eccrine sweat glands is you've got this big lumen. Okay, this big wide lumen where we get our sweat stored before it's released. Very different from what we saw with the eccrine sweat glands. And the apicals, the cells on the surface, have these little blebs. And it's because of these blebs, which are a little bit unusual, that the first histologists, when they described these glands, thought that this was apocrine secretion, where the top of the cell forms the secretion. And then once electron microscopy came around, they were to look at it and they say, oh no, in fact, it's actually a merocrine secretion, or exocytosis. So, coiled tubular glands, we talked about that. It has a large lumen. The lumen stores its secretions. It's restricted locations to the axilla and the anogenital regions. We talked about that. They secrete into hair follicles, so not directly onto the surface, like eccrine. Active from puberty, require sex hormones. We do have myoepithelial cells, which is probably these stripy cells here. So these are the myoepithelial cells, just like we saw with the eccrine sweat glands. They're under the control of adrenaline, so adrenergic receptors, and I talked about the idea of pheromones. Now, the idea of pheromones in humans is usually just sort of dismissed quite easily, but there is a little bit of evidence, scientific evidence out there that some sort of pheromonal control is happening in humans subconsciously. So there's been experiments done with people smelling t-shirts and determining whether someone finds someone attractive by their smell. The other thing which you may have heard about or may have experienced is if you get a number of adult women living together, what can often happen is that their menstrual cycles will move into sync. So they're all menstruate at the same time. And the only way that something like that could happen is if there's some sort of olfactory cue or some other factor which is showing these people's bodies to change in response to these changes in sex hormones at the different stages of the month of the menstrual cycle. I know, controversial, but there is a little bit of evidence out there. Okay, so what I wanted to show you is this section here, okay? So in this section, and this is a bit of a quiz, in this section are eccrine sweat glands, apocrine sweat glands, a blood vessel and a nerve. Can you find them? I'll give you a little while, maybe pause the video because we don't have forever to wait around. Okay, so of course The apocrine sweat glands are characterized by having these big wide lumen. Now it doesn't look exactly like the picture we showed you before, but you know, you've got this multiple coiled appearance of the apocrine sweat glands here. Over here we've got the secretory portion of the eccrine sweat glands. See, the lumen's not very big. We do have the multiple portions, and then these smaller darker regions, these are actually the duct portions. So here's the secretory portion and here's the duct portion. These are probably the duct portions of the apocrine sweat gland here, and they'll be finding a hair follicle to release their secretion. Over here's our blood vessel. Okay, you can see some smooth muscle in its wall, some connective tissue on the outside, and then it's not that easy to see, there's a little endothelial lining there. And this structure, this wavy structure here, down on the bottom right hand side, this is the peripheral nerve. So these are Schwann cells and fibroblasts as part of this peripheral nerve, and remembering they've got this sort of waviness associated with them. Okay, and so this is in the dermis of the axilla. So that's it for glands of the skin. We've got one more part where we're going to be looking at the functions of the skin in part 4. So please proceed firstly to checkpoint number 3 quiz, see how you understood this content, and then move forward to part 4.